Hi, and thank you for joining me today for episode 829 of People Behind the Science. I'm Dr. Marie McNeely, and today we are resharing our conversation with our guest, Dr. Leif Karlstrom. Listeners, Leif uses fluid and solid mechanics approaches to better understand how water moves through glaciers and how magma moves through the Earth's crust to erupt in volcanoes. Much of his work involves developing theoretical models to better describe these processes. And during our interview, Leif shared some excellent stories from his life in science. So without further ado, we'll get started on this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to People Behind the Science. Today, our guest is Dr. Leif Karlstrom. So, Leif, welcome to our show. How are you?
I'm doing very well. Thank you. And yourself?
I'm doing quite well as well. Well, we are excited to have you with us today. And I want to tell our listeners just a little bit about you and your background before we dive into our conversation. So, listeners, Leif is an assistant professor in the Department of Earth Sciences at the University of Oregon. He completed his undergraduate training there at the University of Oregon, receiving a Bachelor's of Science in Physics and Mathematics, as well as a Bachelor's of Music in Violin Performance. He received his PhD in Earth and Planetary Science from the University of California, Berkeley, where he was awarded the Louderback Research Award. And afterwards, Leif was the recipient of an NSF Division of Earth Sciences Postdoctoral Fellowship to conduct research at Stanford University. Now, he joined the faculty at the University of Oregon in 2015, and he's here with us today to talk about his life, his science, and give us a view of his journey. So, Leif, we want to know everything, and we want to know you as a scientist, but also as a person. So, can you start by giving us a window into your life outside of science and how you spend your time?
Sure. I guess I view myself, or my identity, I feel like, is as a scientist, but it's also as a musician and as an outdoor enthusiast and other things. So I sometimes feel like I have multiple personalities, but I do spend quite a bit of time playing music. I have a professional career as a violinist. I play mostly sort of bluegrass and folk music. I've been playing with a group that's nationally and internationally touring over the last few years, and it's been a challenge at times to combine that with the science career, which also is quite demanding on my time, but also quite rewarding. I feel like they feed into each other in a nice way. Other than that, I do enjoy outdoor activities. I've done this since I was a little kid, rock climbing and river rafting and spending time outdoors and all my remaining time, which is
vast, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's vast. I like the comforts of home, cooking and spending time with my partner and all that stuff. So it's always a good thing to be as balanced as you can. And I'm not sure that I achieve that, but I'm certainly diverse.
Absolutely. Well, it's really impressive that you're able to pack so many things into your day. And listeners, this musical group that he plays in is phenomenal. It's called Front Country. And I've listened to some of the songs and Leif, you have quite a library of music that listeners can check out on your website. And we actually do have a little teaser that we can play for our listeners today. So listeners, this is a snippet of the song Old Country by Adam Roskowitz, performed by Leif's group Front Country, with him on lead violin. I love it. Amazing work. Now, listeners, again, Leif's group is called Front Country. And Leif, you mentioned that sometimes it can be a challenge to balance your career as an academic scientist, your career as a professional musician, as well as your passion for the great outdoors. So I have to ask, how do you manage to do it all?
I guess I've had this dual life for a long time, and I'm not sure there's a recipe. I just find the time. Tasks come up and I make commitments, and then I stick to those commitments and I fill in between. And I've done that for many years now. All through college, as you mentioned, I studied music very seriously in college as well as science. And it was an issue then. And as the two careers have sort of progressed, I've somehow managed to keep it going. I always wait for the other foot to fall, and that's going to force me out of one. And it may yet, but so far I've been able to manage.
Excellent. Now, you mentioned that you're doing touring for the music group, and I know travel for science is quite common as well. How do you balance those travel schedules?
Well, I try to keep a detailed calendar.
Yeah. Do you ever try and kind of line things up where you're playing in the same place that you're maybe presenting something for science?
Yeah. Well, so for instance, the group toured in the UK last fall. And as a part of that, and in some ways as a justification of me taking off a couple weeks, I lined up a couple talks, Bristol and Cambridge. And so I did sort of play double duty there for the day that the band had off. I jetted over and gave a talk and then came back to the tour.
Gotcha. Well, tell us a little bit more about your scientific side next. How do you describe your work to someone who has no familiarity with your field?
Really, I'm a fluid mechanist, and I work on problems in earth science. So I study fluid mechanics and solid mechanics as applied to volcanology and glaciology. That's rather general. That's not how I would probably describe myself to the non-scientific audience. Generally, people want to hear about something rather specific. So I'll say that I study how water moves through glaciers or how magma moves through the Earth's crust and erupts on the surface. But I use the tools of fluid and solid mechanics, mostly theoretical. So I don't do a lot of lab work, a little bit of field work, but it's mostly modeling.
Gotcha. Well, you mentioned these two very different fluids here between water and magma. Are there a lot of similarities in terms of the fluid mechanics?
On some level, they obey the same laws, the physical laws. So that's always the starting point for those of us who work in the modeling world. There are some other similarities as well. For example, water is produced on the surface of glaciers when they melt during the summer months, and it percolates down through the glacier to the base of the glacier. And the processes involved in that transport from, in that case, the top of the glacier to the bottom are in some sense generally similar to those that are occurring in the Earth's crust with magma, except in the magmatic case, you have fluid that's moving up. It's driven by buoyancy. So the direction is different, but the physics is similar.
Well, great to get a quick look into your research, and we'll talk more about projects as we go through our interview. But I'm curious to hear about what motivates you. As we mentioned, you have a lot of different things going on in your life. Do you have maybe a saying or a quote or something that you keep in your mind as you go through your very busy days to keep you going?
I have to say that quotes have never been my strong suit. I don't have any guiding principles. I sort of go by actions rather than words generally, and I'm motivated by other people's actions. I'll give you one that I found sort of humorous more than anything, but there's some insight there. It's a quote by this mathematician who I become acquainted with recently, this guy Bjorn Bernier, who's Icelandic, and his name in Icelandic literally translates to bears.
Oh, wow. That's awesome.
Yeah. But yeah, I was visiting with him and we were talking about the process of research and publication. And he said to me, writing a scientific paper and publishing a scientific paper is sort of like reaching the raisin at the end of the hot dog.
Care to decipher this for us?
Well, you could take it a number of ways. One, that Icelandic cuisine is rather odd and that they eat a lot of hot dogs up there.
Gotcha.
And there's something sweet. You go through all this work eating the hot dog, which you might translate to your research project and all the ups and downs that are involved there. And when you finally get to a point that it's finished enough that you can write it up and publish it, that's a sort of sweet nugget at the end of your hot dog.
I like it. Now I'm kind of feeling like I need to try raisins on hot dogs or something.
Yeah.
Sounds strangely appetizing.
You can eat a lot of weird food up there.
I think this is a great quote, and I think it is this great metaphor for what it's like going through not only writing a scientific paper, but maybe writing a grant, doing a project, any of these sorts of things that you're doing in science. But I do want to chat a little bit about some of the people who might have motivated you along the course of your scientific career. So, Leif, can you remember, was there anyone that maybe when you were younger you really looked up to as a mentor or a role model, or maybe even later on in your career?
I have to say that people are a huge part of what motivates me to do any type of work. And I guess both lucky and unlucky to have parents that are quite inspirational. My dad's also a geoscientist. He's a field geologist. And so I got my first taste of the outdoors through him, really taking me on field trips. And he spent his whole life working in the Grand Canyon. So I did my first river trip on the Grand Canyon when I was 8 years old. And my mother is a musician. So in some sense, I'm not doing anything new with my life. I'm just sort of going into the family business. But they're certainly big figures. Other than that, I guess when I first kind of decided this was something I wanted to do in college, really, I was a little bit aimless, didn't have much direction. I knew I loved music and I loved science, and so I was taking classes in both. And I came upon some books by Richard Feynman, the physicist, and those really, I would have to say that those sort of let me know that this was something that really, really inspired me. He was sort of a character that was quite brilliant, of course, scientifically, but he also had a diverse range of other interests that he was quite successful at. He was a musician. He was a character, sort of this cowboy character, and a great writer, very humorous person. I read all of his books multiple times. And I think it was at that point that I sort of decided this was something that I really wanted to do.
Definitely. And I think it's really cool that you ended up following almost both of your parents' footsteps, pursuing both of those careers in science and in music as well. So was your mom a violinist as well?
Still is, in fact.
Oh, awesome.
So, yeah, plays in an orchestra and teaches full time. So, yeah.
Cool.
I didn't learn from her. She was wise enough to farm me out.
Right.
Maybe knowing that I wouldn't take so well to lessons from my mom. But yeah, she's been a good influence my whole life.
Oh, that's cool. Did you ever play together?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, great to hear a little bit about some of these people who had an impact on your life. And I think it's interesting you mentioned that you weren't necessarily 100% sold on science when you started college. You were still kind of doing some soul searching, trying to figure out what you wanted to do. And I always like to talk to people about what got them interested in science in the first place. I think everyone kind of has an interesting story. So, Leif, can you tell us what first sparked this interest for you?
I guess it's a lesson in you can't run away from your family. I remember going on my dad's field trips when I was young and really sort of detesting some aspects of the geology, all this long words that they used to describe rocks. And I just didn't really understand what the point was. So much terminology. And that kind of carried through. I was certainly a little bit rebellious in high school and so forth, and wanted to get as far away from that as I could, both physically and in terms of what I worked on. So I moved from New Mexico, where I grew up, to Oregon to go to college, and didn't really get into geoscience. I took some physics and math. I sort of liked those topics. They seemed to grab me. But in terms of what my direction was, gosh, my summers were spent. One of them, I had spent river guiding in Bend, Oregon. And next summer I spent working in a fish cannery in Alaska. One I spent doing some lab work in a physics lab. A little bit aimless.
Got some variety in there. I like it.
Yeah. The winter before my final year in college, I was home in New Mexico visiting my parents, and one of my dad's colleagues, this woman, Masumi Roy, works at the University of New Mexico. She just sort of asked what I was going to do the next summer, and I told her I didn't really know, but I kind of wanted to do some research. I sort of realized this was something I was supposed to do. And she mentioned that there was one of her former grad school classmates, Michael Manga at the University of California, Berkeley. She thought I'd be a good match for him. She thought I'd learn something from him. That'd be a good opportunity for me. And so I essentially cold called him, wrote him an email asking whether he had any funds to support a student over the next summer. And Michael wrote right back, as he does, and says, actually, in fact, he did have a little bit of funding. And if I wanted to come down and spend a couple months in the Bay Area, then I could do that. And so I did. And it went really well. I guess I took one geology class during my undergrad and I sort of hated it. Went to the first class, realized this was all stuff I'd been hearing my entire life. And then came back in the midterm and the final, and I think, I got like an A- or something. So it was the material that I sort of knew, didn't know I knew, but I knew. And when I started working with Michael, I sort of realized that the problems and the processes that I was interested in from physics could be studied in the context of an Earth system, where instead of working on very tiny scales, particle physics, quantum physics, which didn't really grab me, or very large scales, astrophysics, there was this middle ground, and that actually wasn't in the field of physics at all. It was in earth science, but I could use the same techniques and study the same processes that I was interested in. So I worked with Michael, and that went well. And after that summer, I sort of didn't know that that was going to be my path, and actually didn't think much more of it. Didn't apply to graduate school right away. Didn't really go down that path. In fact, I wasn't sure I wanted to go to grad school at all. But I did have an opportunity to come down to the Bay Area. My girlfriend at the time was in medical school, so I figured, what the heck, I'll come down. And I had a rock climber friend who said he would give me a job washing windows on high-rise buildings in San Francisco.
Oh, wow. That sounds terrifying.
Yeah, I was actually pretty excited about it.
Yeah.
But I've been in contact with Michael Manga just on and off. He was sort of curious where I was going. And when I told him I was moving down to the Bay Area, he said, well, if you're coming down here, why don't you go to graduate school? I can get you into the program here at Berkeley. And so I said, okay. Hadn't really crossed my mind. It sort of ended up, I didn't apply. I sort of just showed up, and that ended up being absolutely the right decision.
That is an awesome story. So you mentioned one thing that I think is really interesting, that this mentorship relationship started with kind of a cold call. And I think for a lot of people out there, the mere idea of cold calling a random scientist can be a little bit scary, but I think it can be often very fruitful, and just kind of forming those connections and making that network can come back later in life to help you. So do you have any advice for people who might be in this position, a little bit worried or scared to reach out to scientists?
Well, scientists are just people, and I think everyone appreciates initiative. I think most people react pretty favorably if it's a serious and well-intentioned message, you'll generally get a reply. And oftentimes there will be opportunities that come of that. So I'd say it's absolutely something that you do. And in fact, making analogies to other fields like the music world or the arts world, that sort of thing is actually what you have to do to be successful at all. You have to network. You have to be able to connect with people who you don't know and you don't have much that you know you have in common before you start talking. And that's absolutely how those worlds work. And I think in science, people rely a little bit too much on the system that provides these sort of established pathways. Whereas I think in many other fields, that's not the case.
Definitely. And I think even in science, for example, if you contact someone and they don't have any opportunities available, they may know someone in their department or someone else who they can connect you then to kind of make it happen. So I think we left off on your journey story as you're getting into graduate school. Can you tell us, were there any other key moments from that point on that took you from this aspiring now scientist to where you are today?
I would say that it's mostly just being in an environment where there are lots of people working very hard that are very smart and working on problems that are big ideas flying around all the time. It's a very intense place to be, intimidating place to be. And it was something that I thrived in, I think. It was what I needed to push me towards my own interests. I identify with the creative side of science very strongly. I think it's very similar to the music mindset that I have. So an environment that really fosters big ideas is the right one for me. And it was also sort of nice to realize that these people were not just these scientific machines.
Right.
Like, for instance, there's two people in that department, Walter Alvarez and Inez Fung, both very famous scientists, really. He was part of the IPCC Nobel Prize in 2007. And Walter Alvarez was part of the team that sort of made the connection between the meteorite impact and the extinction of the dinosaurs, and both quite famous for that. But they both took violin lessons from a guy that I jammed with.
Oh, wow. Small world.
Well, it makes you realize that these people who are very successful in their scientific careers and quite intimidating in some ways in their scientific careers are just people that are trying to live their lives, and they have interests, and those interests align with my interests. I can be better than them at some things, for instance. So it's that sort of realization where you're kind of putting yourself in context of your environment was good for me.
Absolutely. So then you accepted a position here at the University of Oregon. Was it sort of like a homecoming since you had done your undergraduate training here?
Yeah, I guess so. Becoming an academic, I don't think you have a lot of choice about where you go. Some people more than others, but the fact is that there are not that many academic jobs, and you have to really want it. And you have to be willing to go wherever they are. And the fact that I ended up back at Oregon, it's a bit of serendipity in some ways. It was nice to come back. I loved Eugene, and it had changed quite a bit since I had left. And yeah, it feels like a place that fits for sure. But it was never a place that I planned to come back to.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit now about one of these projects that you have going on there at the University of Oregon, something that you are so excited to be working on right now?
Sure. So one in particular, we're studying the Halemaumau volcano, or the vent at the Kilauea in Hawaii. And this is a system that's one of the most active volcanoes in the world. It's been continuously erupting for over 30 years. And it has a crater, this Halemaumau crater, which is right by, it's in the Volcanoes National Park. You can go visit it. There's the Hawaiian Volcanoes Observatory sitting right on the edge of the crater. So it's a really spectacular place to go. And you look into this crater and there's a big lava lake there. So we call this an open vent. And every now and then, there's a chunk of the wall rock, the crater wall, that falls off and hits the lava lake surface. And seismometers all around this volcano, it's very densely instrumented, record the signals associated with these rock falls. And so the rock hits the lake surface, that generates pressure waves that propagate down the column of bubbly magma. And those waves bounce around in the fluid and they couple to the surrounding elastic solid. Those generate seismic waves, and you see those in the seismic record. And the project that I'm involved in now is trying to model the wave propagation in the conduit to try to learn something about both the conduit geometry, which is unknown, and the fluid properties, which are unknown, just by using the record of ground motion recorded kilometers away. And that sort of thing I'm really excited about because we have the potential to sort of probe or image in situ the processes that are going on inside a volcanic conduit, where it's not really something that people have been able to do. Volcanologists normally learn about volcanic systems by studying eruptive deposits. So you're looking at material that has already erupted, right?
Right. It's the history of it. Yeah.
Yeah. So with this active monitoring, we have the opportunity to probe the system while it's going and actually prior to eruption. And one of the things that volcanologists are quite interested in is learning about the volatile content, so water and CO2 are the primary volatile species that are dissolved in magmas. And bubbles are sort of the whole story in terms of volcanic eruptions. Anyone knows who's like shook up a Coke bottle or something and then turn off the top, that bubble formation and expansion can be a rather explosive process.
Exciting, a good prank, whatever you'd like to call it.
Yeah, right. And that's what drives essentially all volcanic eruptions, is the exsolution of water, primarily water and CO2. And then those bubbles expand as they get to shallower depths, and that drives acceleration and you get eruptions. And one of the key things for understanding how volcanoes work is to try to figure out how much water is in these things, right? It's sort of probe the eruptive potential of a given system and understand why it behaves the way it does. And that's not something that people have been able to do in situ. Right? We have all these sort of remote methods to try to estimate volatile content, but we have an opportunity here to actually directly image through the seismic record the volatile content of the system. So I think we've had some success with it so far. We think we can match the observed signals with our forward models of wave propagation in a magma-filled conduit. And it's ongoing work, but I think there's going to be some really neat things that we learn from it.
Well, this is very cool. And I think you drew some good analogies with talking about the Coke bottle as a model of eruption that many of us can kind of relate to. And I'm curious, you mentioned that many of the measurements you study are taken from kilometers away. So have you ever actually been on the ground, and are you able to take any measurements at the site of the volcano? Are you able to walk around in those crazy thermal suits and be where the action is?
I've never been in one of those crazy suits. Maybe one day. I have to say, most of the time I see them, it seems like a bit of a stunt.
Yeah.
Which is fine. Most of the measurements that are most meaningful are collected a little bit more remotely. Of course, there's maybe a dozen volcanoes actively erupting at any given time in the world. There's lots of volcanoes in the world, and many of them are not very well instrumented. So Hawaii is one of the best instrumented in the world. And there you have lots of different types of data. And for the type of work that I do, as I mentioned, I'm mostly sort of theoretical. So I'm not really on the ground so much. I've been to Kilauea, I've walked around, looked at the deposits, and I think like having a grounding in the natural world and observations based in reality is important to deriving a model that means anything. But I don't, at the end of the day, need to actually go there.
Gotcha. But it's definitely not something you turn down when you have that opportunity to go to Hawaii, right?
Absolutely not.
So now we've talked about some of the fantastic things you've been able to do along your career path as a scientist and some of the great work that's going on in your research group today. But I want to hear about some of the challenges, some of the struggles, and some of the setbacks in science. I think when we hear from scientists, it's often the success stories. You hear about the great things coming out of their laboratories, the wonderful things they're able to do. But I think so much toil and turmoil goes into any of those successes. So Leif, do you have a story that you can share with us of one of your own failures or a challenge that you faced and how you worked through it?
Yeah, I think most of my days are failures.
That's a sad way to go through life. No.
Well, it's an opportunity, I guess.
Yeah.
It's about the process. I view publications, and certainly after you've read a number of scientific papers, you realize that it's not the end all be all. When you publish a paper, it's a waypoint along the way, and it may not even be right. In many cases, it's not right. It's just sort of a snapshot in time of where you are in a given system. And as a modeler, you're constantly failing. You're trying to solve some problem either with a pencil and paper or on a computer. And it's hard. You don't really know. That's what sort of research is all about. You don't know the answer before you start. If you did, you wouldn't study that problem. So your code doesn't work. You're not clever enough to figure out the solution to a problem. You're not clever enough to figure out someone else's solution to a problem. Mm-hmm. There's lots of roadblocks. I had a friend who says if you're writing a program and it works, that just means that you have an even number of bugs.
Yeah. The signs cancel out by the end.
Yeah, they cancel out, right? So it doesn't mean that it's right. It just means that there's an even number, not an odd number. So that's sort of the MO for most of us, I think. And I've done a little bit of lab work in grad school. My advisor is really into analog fluids experiments. So he had this basement lab where he played with corn syrup and wax and all kinds of materials that are an analog to geologic materials, analogs to magma, analogs to crustal rocks, that kind of stuff.
So what's an analog to magma, if I may ask?
Well, corn syrup is actually quite good.
Really?
Yeah, it's viscous fluid and you can mix bubbles in there. And he had this whole apparatus that was sort of simulating decompression rates in volcanoes. That was this big vacuum chamber. And at the base of that vacuum chamber was a plastic tube. You fill that tube with corn syrup that you've mixed with an egg beater to get some air in there. And then you put these 2 aluminum foil diaphragms in there and then evacuate the chamber above it. And so when the pressure difference between your sample and the vacuum chamber gets large enough, the aluminum foil ruptures and the fluid decompresses. And then you film that with a high-speed camera, and that gives you a way to probe the processes that are going on in volcanic conduits. So corn syrup, lots of corn syrup. It's very sticky. Oftentimes there'd be rats that would get stuck in the lab floor that was a little bit sticky. And so there was some kind of gross, sad situations that arose there.
Good for catching flies too, I imagine.
Yeah. Another sort of funny anecdotal thing, I guess, is I also studied water flow through glaciers, as I mentioned, and that started in grad school. And I had this idea for an experiment to study the melting of ice by the turbulent flow of water. Michael was very kind and let me sort of pursue this idea. And so I bought all these pumps and a big walk-in freezer to make an ice block. And the idea was to circulate water through this ice block and image it through time. So I designed this complicated apparatus. I was going to have tubes coming out of this big meat locker and had it all set up. And I was going to do my first run, and I was quite excited. And I brought all the students from the research group down, and we turned it on, and it worked. Water was flowing through this ice block, and it was melting. And it was great, and I was quite excited. And then it went terribly wrong.
Oh, no.
And the water melted through the ice. There were some things that I hadn't quite thought through.
Like drainage, perhaps? Or
yeah, and so the water started going everywhere, and people
oh, no.
So that's the kind of very common situation you find yourself in until you get it right. And once you get it right, it's pretty easy, right? You have your procedure and you go through it and you work through the results. But the process of getting there is a long one.
Definitely. And I really like this point you brought up that every day can feel like a failure as a scientist. And I think as a scientist, you really have to get comfortable with failing. And that's not something that oftentimes you have a lot of experience in before maybe going to graduate school or starting a master's or whatever it might be. So how did you cope then with maybe going from being a relatively successful undergraduate to now experiencing all these challenges and failures?
I'm not sure I was that successful of an undergraduate.
You had experience coming in. I like it.
I guess I've always been surrounded by people who are much better than I am. So I constantly have a bit of an underdog mentality, which is good sort of reality check. It's good to be humble, right? You're sort of a dime a dozen in this world. There's lots of people that are better than you. But it's quite motivating, I think. As long as you work hard, you'll get there. You have an objective, you make decisions, and that's been the guiding principle for me. And I have to say my pathway through science and music and life in general is rather wandering. So the opportunities that come up, I take advantage of them, and sometimes they work out and sometimes they don't. So I don't necessarily think that going into grad school for me wasn't a big deal. It was just sort of another thing to do, another sort of set of struggles. And I did see other students who perhaps are more like what you talked about, right? They came through quite successful as undergrads, maybe went to a small liberal arts school and really shone there. And then it turns out you're a small fish in a big pool in grad school. And that's a hard lesson to learn for a lot of people. I was lucky enough to have been beaten down from an early age.
Yeah. Your parents already getting you interested in science and music. So yeah, already from the beginning. Well, we don't just want to talk about these tough times, although I think you shared a lot of helpful information for our listeners out there who might be in this transition between undergraduate and graduate school, trying to cope with all these challenges. But now, can you talk about one of your success stories, Leif, and share one of these moments, whether it was a really big win in science or even just a small victory that meant a lot to you?
There's this project that I came up with in graduate school. I had some friends that were sort of extreme kayakers, if you like. They like to get in their kayaks and go off waterfalls. And
oh my gosh, that's intense.
Yeah, totally crazy. So we were hanging out one day, and I was really interested in glaciers because I like to be in the mountains, and they're just fascinating things. And we were looking at pictures of the Greenland ice sheet and seeing all these streams that float over the surface. And they were talking, I was like, well, wouldn't it be crazy to get in your kayak and paddle down one of these streams? And we realized how stupid it was right away, of course, because these streams pour into these things called moulins, which are holes in the ice.
Oh, yeah, that could be a problem.
Yeah, you're not coming out if you go on one of those things. One of the more terrifying things I've ever witnessed is rushing water pouring into this black hole in the ice. Anyway, I got interested in supraglacial streams and how they form and what governs their morphology. If you start looking at Google Earth or any of these things, you start to see these just really compelling patterns that they form. They're melting into the ice surface, and they're they're meandering all over the place, and they're behaving a lot like rivers we would associate with bedrock landscapes or with other terrestrial settings, but they're different in the sense that it's water just melting into ice. So I came up with what I thought was a neat problem to study and went to my advisor, and he was like, well, yeah, I mean, that's really neat. I get why you're interested in this. It's neat, but it's not interesting.
Really?
In the sense that it's not fundable.
Gotcha.
And I guess that's a lesson, right? In terms of the business of science, is it's one part creative process and one part sort of testing where you're at in terms of the rest of the community, right? What are the problems that people think are interesting? It doesn't mean you can't work on something that people don't realize is interesting, but you have to convince them that it is, right? So,
right.
And I had other things going, so he sort of tolerated my working on this, and we published a couple papers actually in grad school on this. And recently I had the opportunity, I guess it was last summer, a colleague who I'd met at a meeting emailed me and was like, well, I have all this data from Greenland. Is there anything we can do? And I was actually touring around with the band and read his email and thought about it. And was like, well, yeah, actually, I think there is something we can do. And wrote a little NASA proposal in the van and submitted it. And lo and behold, it gets funded. I would say that was a big success. And so I wrote my advisor and said, well, look, these superglacial streams are interesting after all.
Yeah. Remember when you said, yeah. Well, Leif, I think that is a fantastic success. Congratulations on that. And so exciting that you were able to then pursue that problem that you had been really interested in. I know we chatted about your life outside of science, and you have a lot going on. I'm not sure whether you sleep or whether you have time to read for fun, but I do like to bug people on our show for a book recommendation. So is there a book that you've read that really kind of left an impression on you, whether it was a science book or a non-science book, that you'd like to pass on to me and our listeners today?
Sure. I have to stick to the sort of classics here. Edward Abbey's Desert Solitaire is a book that's made a big impression on my life. I've read it multiple times. I grew up in the Southwest U.S., and there you're living in this pretty wild environment to begin with. It's more or less nonfiction by a guy who had some sort of fairly revolutionary anarchist ideals and also sort of helped spurn the environmental movement as we know it today. It's a great story of his personal experiences working at Arches National Park and various other places in the Southwest. So I'd recommend that to anyone, really.
Excellent. Well, we will put that on our website for our listeners to find there. And I know we've touched on travel a couple different times during our conversation, but I do always like to hear about the wonderful places that scientists get to travel for their work. So, Leif, do you have a favorite place or a favorite memory that you had somewhere where you were traveling for science?
I got to go to the Galapagos once, mostly for a conference, actually, but that's by far and away the coolest place I've been for science. So a wild environment, of course, classic from the evolutionary biology world, but it's also a very unique volcanic environment as well. And we got to spend a couple weeks out in Ecuador and Galapagos tramping around and talking about science. People came in from all over the world. It was one of these small conferences. Volcanology is not a very big field, as you might imagine, and this was a subset of that. So you get sort of meeting of the minds here, some of the people that you read papers about, and to get to do that in a setting like the Galapagos is a pretty special thing.
Definitely. And I know there's some differences between the different islands. I've actually had the opportunity to go quite a few years ago for a course in island biology. But did you spend all your time on one island, or did you get to travel around between them?
Oh, yeah. Fernandina was my favorite.
Yeah, that was a great one. So what did you like about Fernandina?
That was one where we got to walk around and take a tour of some of the volcanic features. And you really get a sense for what makes the Galapagos unique once you really go anywhere in that system. But there's not a whole lot of surface water. It's sort of weird. It's on the equator, but it's surrounded by these upwelling cold currents. And so the climate is just wild. And so compare and contrast that to Hawaii, right, which is a sort of similar volcanic environment, but in a very wet climate, it just looks totally different. And so you're walking around in this landscape and it's young volcanic features, and every now and then a huge tortoise will pop out.
Right. There's cacti everywhere. Yeah.
It's just weird plants. It looks like an alien landscape.
Absolutely. Well, I 100% agree with you. I'd have to say Galapagos was my favorite place that I've been for science as well. So excellent choice there, Leif.
Yeah.
So now we've talked a little bit about some of the experiences that you've shared with your colleagues in science and some of the wonderful people that you've met. And I think the people are what makes science great in a lot of ways. And there are stereotypes out there about what scientists are like. And we try and break them on our show by showing people a different side of scientists. So is there maybe a quirky tradition you can share, just a funny memory that you've shared with colleagues that kind of showcases this human side of science?
Well, I guess I've shared a little bit of that already, but another one is my advisor, while the first year I was there, got a MacArthur Award. Mm-hmm. A really big deal in science. So they call these things genius awards, and who knows if he's a genius or not. But
he got the award, so it's on paper. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So funny enough, he's sort of a good looking guy. People magazine kind of found him as they wanted to showcase. They have the 100 most beautiful people issue or something.
Yeah.
And they somehow found him because he was on the MacArthur list. And they were like, oh, this is a good looking guy. So they came and interviewed him and took some pictures of him in a leather jacket.
Model shots. And, yeah.
So that was pretty funny. And the story of it all is that he didn't tell his wife that this had happened. And she only found out because her mother was in a grocery store checkout line and was thumbing through the People magazine issue and saw him. So she was like, why didn't you tell me? And his response is like, none of the people in my life, none of the people that I think are important read People magazine. So I didn't think it was relevant.
That's a very scientific answer there. Well, that is an amazing claim to fame. I never would have guessed that was where the story was going. So, well, I think that is a hilarious story and funny that he didn't tell anyone.
Yeah.
So wonderful to hear about one of these funny anecdotes, things that happen in science. And you mentioned some of these mentors that you've had along the course of your journey, and it's fun to share hilarious memories and experiences with them. But I think they're also great people to bounce ideas off of. And asking these big questions is a wonderful way to explore creativity in science. So I'm curious, Leif, do you have one big question that if I give you everything, funding, staff, technology, feasibility, sky is the limit here, what would you want to do or what would you want to answer?
It's great to have big ideas, I guess. I'll keep mine toward the field that I'm in. Of course, there are lots of big issues. Actually, I'll make one comment, which is that I think one of the biggest issues, because I have a foot in both these worlds of sort of arts and science, is that there's more in common than most people realize in terms of a big question to figure out if you had all the resources is to try to bridge that gap. It's a very human thing, right? But that science is a creative process, but the language that they speak is totally different in the art world. And I feel like that would open up a lot of things. So that's one. If we want to stick to science, well, if I had all the resources I can, I would probably try to probe the plumbing system of volcanic systems. A lot of as I sort of mentioned in one of the things we talked about, there's not a whole lot of really direct constraints we have on how magma moves through the crust. And if you look through the literature, there's all kinds of funny cartoons that are sort of the standard paradigm for how people think about magma movement. And it'd be really great to directly image a magma chamber or directly drill into one. It's a challenging endeavor, but I think you'd immediately solve a lot of the problems in volcanology if you could do that.
Do you think we will ever get that technology? Maybe not to drill into it, but at least to image it?
Yeah, I think it's possible.
How far away do you think we are, if you had to guess?
Well, I think if the amount of attention that was paid to earthquakes was focused on volcanoes, we would solve it in 10 years.
Interesting. Well, fascinating questions for me and our listeners to ponder. And I love this idea of kind of bridging the gap between arts and science, because I think you're absolutely right. There is so much overlap there, and they're both very creative processes, as we mentioned. So wonderful questions to bring up here. And I know over the course of your career, you've had a lot of mentors. Perhaps they've given you quite a bit of advice over the course of your career. Is there any one piece of advice that sticks out in your mind, Leif, that was maybe a really helpful piece of advice that you'd like to pass on to our listeners today?
Just work hard.
I like it. Short, sweet, simple.
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to be a genius. You don't have to have all the opportunities in the world. But generally, if you work really hard, you'll get somewhere. Definitely.
Well, great message to leave our listeners with. Is there any other last piece of advice that you want to give them from you, or a last note of inspiration that you want to end on?
Well, I guess it's important to be broad thinking and a well-rounded person. I think a lot of people in science particularly get caught up, get sort of myopic in their approach, and you're missing out, I guess.
Absolutely. It's a big world out there, and I think you can do lots of different things. And I think people worry when they take a career in science that they're going to be almost pigeonholed and sort of stuck in this very narrow field. But right, I think it is important to expand your horizons, maybe talk to someone who's in a completely different field or have hobbies outside of science to kind of be that well-rounded person. So great message to leave our listeners with today. Can you tell them if they want to learn more about you and the work that you do, Leif, where should they go?
I have a website. You could also email me directly. It's my name, leif@uoregon.edu.
Perfect. Well, listeners, check out that website. Like I said, he has both his science and his music posted there. So take a look at both. And Leif, thank you so much for joining us today on the program.
Thank you.
Well, it has been a pleasure to chat with you, and listeners, a pleasure to have you with us as well. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science. Your voyage to explore the lives of today's exceptional scientists has just begun. You can find everything we talked about today, including our guests' favorite books, biographies, photos, and more, when you visit us at www.peoplebehindthescience.com. I look forward to chatting with you next time on People Behind the Science.